Folks, I got sick earlier this month, which will probably explain the sound of my voice, so I need a short video to help get my wheels spinning again properly. So with that considered, today I'm going to visit a concept I didn't quite have a finished script for and discuss a little piece of it. See, a while ago, I was scripting a video about bizarre, noteworthy, and cool expansions of non-video game-centric franchises into the world of video games. You know, stuff that's canonically important in particular. This, of course, presents some interesting spaces for discussion on what counts. For example, could we count something like Neopets: The Darkest Fairy? I think most of us would count Neopets as a video game if asked, despite it being a browser-based, community thing. Like, sort of a limbo between video game and not video game. We could have a whole chat about what constitutes a video game. Might get a little off topic from the channel's main thrust, but why the devil not? The follow-up here is that I don't know how well that would qualify because I know nothing about it except its title. Star Trek Judgment Rights is one of the ones I could have said the most about. A quick note here that I realized, about a day before I was going to release this video to the public, that a thing that I forgot about was the phrase expanded universe, and that what I wanted to convey with this particular list was games that contribute to and open up an expanded universe. And I would prefer it to be things that are still canon, not things that are decanonized or something like that. So, unfortunately, it's now too late to change this whole video, so you'll just have to deal with it. Maybe I'll come back to this subject some other time. Not necessarily this specific game, but I might talk about it in light of that anyway. And now, we return you to the rest of the video in progress. Thank you. It's a fantastic adventure game. One I've got to talk about someday just for being cool, and one with a particularly heart-wrenching sequence in the second last mission, which I'll talk about now to give you a little something. A little preview of whenever I decide to expand into just talking about great game stories, and I gas up Judgment Rights for whipping the llama's ass. In Though This Be Madness, there's a sequence where Spock performs a Vulcan mind meld with I don't know that I want to say this name because I'm pretty sure it's basically an old-timey slur for someone with significant mental disabilities, but listen, I'm safe. I'm quoting the game's script and I'll only say it once. The character's name is Puzzlewit. Through Spock's mind meld, she paints a harrowing image of her mind falling apart and fears of being unable to escape being locked in her own mind that made me burst into tears and have to pause my rewatch of a friend's old playthrough. I was not expecting that, but I also don't know what I expect out of Star Trek anymore. Last time I watched Star Trek was, good lord, 16 to 17 years ago? When I was in high school, one of the local TV stations in Chicago played original series episodes at 5:30 or 6 in the morning or so, which is right around when I got up to start getting ready for the day. I think I'm going to have to put that on my list again at some point. But the thing is, okay, that's a cool and good game that deserves its own being talked about, but I couldn't think of a ton of examples of this. But granted, I also don't know much about stuff like, say, Star Wars games. Most of the time, when a franchise expands into a new medium like this, it's just adaptation. So for the time being, I have scrapped the project. So meanwhile, let's talk about one of the other games I had on this list because the concept is so deeply bizarre. One cool thing you get out of narrative art forms is the ability to iterate upon existing stories in new and interesting forms. My mom's a big Shakespeare fan, and she loves to talk about the many adaptations of Shakespeare that pull the play out of the original setting and put it elsewhere. If YouTube isn't being a total schmuck, in the background there should be some very heavily filtered clips from Hamlet starring Ethan Hawke, which is one of those interpretations that my mom regards as extra weird, but which I've put up here mostly because it serves as an excellent object lesson in what I'm talking about for being such a huge swerve from the original setting. You can tell any story you want however you want if you know what you're doing. Do you want to retell a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure saga using the cast of Homestuck? Hey, go for it. You might be able to make it work. Even history is a perfectly viable thing to mine for adaptation. Which brings me rather perfectly to Yu-Gi-Oh! The Duelists of the Roses. What a singularly weird game we have on our hands today, folks. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, of course, first and foremost, a manga series. After the first few story cycles, Kazuki Takahashi decided to lean very heavily on his first big hit, a trading card game known in story originally as Magic and Wizards, later called Duel Monsters, meant as an homage to Magic the Gathering. A dark wish-fulfillment series for gothy nerds who got the crap kicked out of them for being into games turned into what I can only describe as, what if we made a sports manga out of a trading card game with more visual themes of torture and black magic? And it's a great concept, really. Probably beats the pants off of just playing it straight as a series about playing card games, and it fills a niche that is very different from the one that just an adaptation of existing card game lore would. So, what's the deal with this game? What is it? Well, it's the story of the War of the Roses, as played out by the characters of the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. Yeah, it's a little bit of an odd choice, isn't it? Certainly it's not characteristic of the franchise's obsession with all things Egyptian. The delightful absurdity starts out quite early as our boy introduces himself as Henry Tudor before telling us to call him Yugi. It gets sillier as it goes, of course, especially since we eventually dig into characters whose names are distinctly less real regardless of region. Bones, whose name is canonically spelled B-O-N-Z.
I mean, in-game he's referred to as Necromancer, but if there's one company I won't let fool me, it's fucking Konami.
Is an opponent here. Or, since this is England, should that be B-O-N-Z? This is a terrible joke that exists solely to reveal that the presenter is American. Sorry. Of course, that's far from the only twist to the story or bit of absurdity to be found here. For a start, well, I'm no English history expert. I'm a good, red-blooded American who is married to a bald eagle and masturbates furiously to the thought of dressing up like a native and sneaking onto a ship to throw its cargo of crates of tea into the Boston Harbor. So the only thing that is more anathema to me than using the word anathema is looking up anything to do with English history. Joking aside, I didn't really do a whole lot of research here, because I feel I can say with great confidence that nobody during the Wars of the Roses summoned the Welsh mythological figure Manawydan Fablir. Excuse my pronunciation, I've thrown some spelling on screen, and remember that this is a language that's a bit of an odd one compared to English, and nor was he the brother of some evil thing that was known in ancient Egypt. It especially did not happen at Stonehenge, which, wow, Stonehenge and the Fae, a double whammy of easy ways to do goofy shit in the British Isles, huh? And, not even talking from the perspective of gameplay mechanics, which are generally just conveyances to get players between parts of the story anyway, I'm pretty sure most of the other supernatural stuff never happened. Nor did anyone at the time have hair like... Good grief, where do I start with the unrealistic hairdos, huh? The whole vibe is somewhat of a farcical one. On its face, it's at bare minimum like the kind of farce that tries to intentionally create bathos as part of its sense of humor. But even outside of that, or the obvious absurdity, there's a certain jocularity to some aspects of the dialogue that makes the whole thing incredibly silly. At bare minimum, the localization team knew this was conceptually a little... silly. That, however, is something that makes the game stand out as being one worth particular interest. It's pretty unique. You're not likely to find another game doing something similar, especially in terms of its shockingly underused conceit in the world of gaming. Which is a good way to know that this one is an idea that someone really believed in as being important to make. I don't know exactly why this game exists, or at least not why a game with this story exists. But I feel like someone really believed that this was the way to go, if only because the concept is completely off its rocker. See, this game is a sequel to the PlayStation game Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Memories, something which is significantly less weird plot-wise, and if we're being honest, gameplay-wise too, and that's apparent from this game's Japanese title, with a subtitle translating more or less to Succeeded Memories to match FM's Sealed Memories. That game technically dealt with an alternate history, being that it mostly revolved around the characters from ancient Egypt in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Canon. At least in the earlier versions of the continuity, as I'll discuss in a minute or so. So perhaps the writers decided one alteration of history demanded more, which, well, maybe so. Also, the idea of seeing repeats of character designs kind of works with original flavor Yu-Gi-Oh! Because reincarnation is so frequently a theme in that series to begin with. Although seeing Shoddy be that white is incredibly weird. Like, are you sure this is the same dude? I mean, if you insist, game. There's a few things that are unique to this Yu-Gi-Oh! Timeline. In some previous games, there were more, such as Kaiba possessing the Millennium Rod. But here, it's mostly two faces who are probably a little unfamiliar to those who haven't dealt with the Duel Monsters video game continuity. After this game, Dark Knight, here as MFL, and Haishin, or Richard Sly Sheen of York as he is in this game, would only ever appear again in Falsebound Kingdom and then be retired from the franchise entirely as far as I can remember. Why this is the case, I'm not exactly sure. Forbidden Memories and its sequels are also the sequels to a series of games simply called the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters series, which will all be released on the upcoming Yu-Gi-Oh! Early Days collection, many of which are coming out outside of Japan for the first time ever. My guess is that quite a few of these characters were originally intended to have great importance to the franchise before Kazuki Takahashi actually finalized the backstory and decided they weren't that great. Or maybe this was always intended to be an alternate backstory to the franchise with game continuity exclusive characters. I'm not exactly sure, and as of a few years ago, I feel I can reasonably say it's gotten a bit tougher to find the answers. Regardless, this means that these games and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime and manga series you already know aren't canon to each other, despite the fact that quite a few of the games deal in very familiar arcs. So ultimately, it wouldn't really fit in that list I mentioned earlier. I think even with Judgment Rights, the Brassicans showed up elsewhere in the Star Trek franchise later. Meanwhile, these guys are canon only to their parallel telling of the series' lore, and as far as I've been able to ascertain, that parallel story remains parallel. So perhaps all it really would have had to go on for such a list is a weird concept. An AU, particularly an outlandish one, is neat and all, but here I was looking for something that was like a proper continuation of the series, something necessary to get the full story. Well, saying that, I'd still recommend playing these games anyway if you're that much of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Lore head. They may not be canon to the rest of the franchise, but if nothing else, it's neat to get a look at what was canon at one point, or at least possibly was canon. Why not delve into everything, right? If I want to go through a whole series, which I often do, I think that getting into things like this, which could probably be called minutia if I felt like being really mean about it, is probably the most fun part. To see the outlands of a series, the fringes, the utterly bizarre places out on the margins that eventually the authors decided were failed experiments. Or at least have that vibe, even if that's not what the case was, blah blah blah. But basically, if you're gonna dive deep, dive deep. It's where the biggest rewards are. Anyway, yeah, short video this time with very little special to say. I started on another script that gets a little bit more in-depth, and I've got a couple of other scripts that I started late last year that I'm almost done with, some of which I probably am done with by the time this comes out. I just needed to do something a bit more low stakes on account of the whole getting sick thing this month. We'll be digging into some stuff a little less simplistic pretty soon. Yes, hi, hello, it's a short video this time, and once again, I do apologize for that. Like I said, I have been ill, so I'm only just now catching up to things. I have some more plans. Hopefully I'll get another video out in February. I can't necessarily guarantee that, but dang it, I'm gonna try. So as always, thank you for watching, and I also have to give out a few special thanks this time. Thank you to Plastic Alan for letting me use footage from one of his Super Star Wars streams. And thank you to Round the Wheel, from whom I got the footage of Star Trek Judgment Rights from some 14-year-old videos. Wow. Additionally, I did end up butting up against my own personal deadline, so I ended up using some footage of this very game from YouTuber KA6Scope, who I believe also used to speedrun a couple of these games way back. However, most of this is in the original edit that I posted on Patreon. I'm hoping to replace all of that with my own footage of the game. Some of it already is mine, which you can tell by the fact that it's not as severely stretched as his is. So regardless of how much of that ends up into the final cut, I am still going to put Scope's account into the description, both on Patreon and on YouTube, and I'm not re-recording a new outro, because, I mean, the guy deserves some credit because that stuff was pretty helpful at one point or another in the process here. And of course, thank you to my patrons and everybody else who supports my video creation. Patreon.com/lunariandelia is the URL. I believe I've been saying it wrong, or I had the link wrong or something for a while, because I changed it at some point and I forgot that I did. A little bit embarrassing, to be sure. Also, I stretch... Shit. What was that? I'm leaving that in. Also, I stream over on... God damn it, I haven't stopped yet. Hang on. Also, I stream over on Twitch, twitch.tv/lunariandelia, 7 p.m. Central Time, all weekdays. So, right now, that's Central Standard, which is UTC minus 6 hours. Daylight Savings Time is in like a month or something. The sad part is that people in non-Daylight Savings Time countries probably know that better than I do, so... Anyway, it would be really great if you could join me, and quite frankly, this outro has gotten way too long as it stands already, so that's all. Good night.